Hello, fifth grade. Okay, so like I said in The Lost Presidents, I'm going to read out of Experiment in Liberty by George Grant, just the section on the forgotten presidents, and it gives just a little snapshot on each of the men and what they accomplished during their time as president of the colonies and also just during their lives. So, let's dive in. Forgotten presidents. During the years of the War for Independence, then afterward for another 6 years, 15 men served as President of the United States for the Continental and Confederation Congresses. These men led the new nation from the old colonial system to an independent country and a prominent member of the international order. They ranged in age and experience from a variety of backgrounds. The first, Peyton Randolph, was a revered statesman from Virginia and Speaker of that state's pre-war House of Burgesses, which basically was like the leadership of Virginia. There we go. Others were prominent businessmen like John Hancock of Massachusetts, Henry Middleton, and Henry Lawrence, who were both from South Carolina. Arthur St. Clair was born in Scotland and trained in the British Army during the 7 Years' War, became an effective militia leader in the early days of the independence movement, partially because he knew how England fought, and he was very invaluable in terms of giving insight on how to beat them. Where was I? Thomas Mifflin, a better politician than soldier, signed the Treaty of Paris that ended the War of Independence and received George Washington's commission at the end of hostilities. Elias Boudinot of New Jersey never made a name for himself in American politics, but he was a crucial diplomat for his country in the early years of the war. In all of these men, there served a distinction as the head of state for the infant American nation, and much like the shaky political union of the Articles of Confederation, the forgotten presidents might have had very visible faults, but they served their country with a distinction at a time when the cause of American independence could still be won or lost. In the troubled days to come, as the new nation grappled with the task of forming a more perfect union, America needed men of principle and men of action, for which America proved to be fertile soil. Who was the first president of the United States? Ask any school child and they will readily tell you George Washington. And of course, they would be wrong, at least technically. Washington was not inaugurated until April 30th, 1789, and yet the United States continually had functioning governments from as early as September 5th, 1774, and operated as a Confederate nation as early as July 4th, 1776. During that nearly 15-year interval, Congress, the First Continental Congress, and then later the Confederation Congress, was always moderated by a duly elected president. As the chief executive officer of the government of the United States, the president who was recognized was the head of the state. Washington was thus the 15th, and his administration was the 17th in a long line of distinguished presidents. He just happened to be the first under the current Constitution. So, who were the people who preceded him? Peyton Randolph from Virginia, from 1723 to 1775. That was his years of life. When the delegates gathered in Philadelphia for this First Continental Congress, they promptly elected the former King's Attorney of Virginia as moderator and president of their convention. He was a propitious choice, a good choice. He was a legal prodigy, having studied under the Inner Temple in London, and served as his native colony's attorney general, basically leader, and tutored many of the most able men of the South William and Mary College, including young Patrick Henry. So he taught Patrick Henry the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. That's what he's most famous for. So he taught him. Pretty distinguished. His home in Williamsburg was the gathering place for Virginia's legal and political gentry, and it remains a popular attraction even to this day. I'm going to modify some of the phrasing so that it's a little more understandable. I apologize, Dr. Green, if you're watching. I love it. I'm just going to change it slightly for 10-year-olds. He served as a delegate at the Virginia House of Burgesses, remember, government, and had been a commander under William Byrd in the colonial militia. He was a scholar of some renown, having begun a self-guided reading of the classics when he was 13. At 13, guys, he started picking books to read that were really difficult just so he could learn. Despite suffering poor health, he served the Continental Congress as president twice, from September 5th to October 21st in 1774, and from May 10th to May 23rd, 1775. He never lived to see independence, and yet he was numbered among the nation's most revered founders. Henry Middleton, the second elected president, was one of the wealthiest planters in the South, and one of the patriarch, the leader, father, of one of the most powerful families anywhere in the nation. His public spirit was evident from an early age. He was a member of his state's common house, like Senate, from 1744 to 1747. During the last 2 years, he served as the Speaker, which is the person in charge of the Congress. He was a member of the South Carolina Council from 1755 to 1770. He won he won valor in the war with the Cherokees during 1760 to 1761 and earned him wide recognition throughout the colonies and demonstrated cool leadership abilities while under extreme pressure. He was elected as a delegate for the first session of Continental Congress when Peyton Randolph was forced to resign the presidency. His peers immediately turned to Middleton to complete the term because of his health and stuff. He served as the nation's president from October 22nd, 1774, until Randolph was able to resume his duties briefly in May of 1775. Afterwards, he was a member of the Council of Safety and helped to establish the young nation's policy towards encouragement and support of education. So he was one of the biggest advocates for education. In 1776, February, he resigned his political involvements in order to prepare his family and lands for what he believed was the inevitable war. His son Arthur replaced him, however, eventually becoming a signer of the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. So you'll find Arthur Middleton's signature on those if you looked. John Hancock. Probably the biggest guy that we hear from. He was the third president, a patriot, rebel leader, and a merchant who signed his name into immortality with giant strokes on the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. The boldness of his signature has made it live in American minds as a perfect expression of strength and freedom and defiance in the face of British tyranny. He served 2 times in the Continental Congress as president, 2 widely spaced terms, 1775 to 1777, and then a second from 1785, that's a typo, to 1786. Hancock was the presiding officer when the members approved the Declaration of Independence, and because of his position, it was his official duty to sign the document first, but not necessarily as dramatically as he decided to. He figured prominently in another historic event, the Battle of Lexington. The British troops who fought there April 10th, 1775, knew Hancock and Samuel Adams were in Lexington, and they had come there to capture those 2 men specifically. In fact, Hancock and Adams would have been captured had they not been warned by Paul Revere. Again, one of the famous people. I told you in the other video, there are so many people who loomed large, and already so many. Okay, as early as 1768, Hancock defied the British by refusing to pay charges on cargo of one of his ships, the taxes. One of Boston's wealthiest merchants, he was recognized by the citizens as well as the British as a rebel leader and was elected as president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress accordingly. He was chosen as president of the Continental Congress in 1775 and became known beyond the borders of Massachusetts, having served as a colonel in Massachusetts Governor's Guards, which was their army. He hoped to be named the commander of the American forces until John Adams, who was the second president, actually nominated George Washington, who ultimately got the job. He was the first governor of Massachusetts, and he helped win ratification in Massachusetts, gaining enough popular recognition to make him a contender for the newly created presidency of the United States. But yet again, Washington was elected instead of him. So he kind of kept having this back and forth with Washington on wanting stuff. I want to be the commander of the armies. Nope, Washington. I want to be the first official president of the United States under the current Constitution. Nope, Washington. So that's fun. He was the wealthiest New Englander supporting the patriotic cause, and he was willing to commit much for the risk of freedom. Henry Laurens, 1724 to 1792, the only American president ever to be held as a prisoner of war by a foreign power. Laurens was heralded after he released the father of our country by no less a personage than George Washington. So he was taken captive. George Washington got him released. His ancestors had come to America from France after the Edict of Nantes, not important at this time. He was raised and educated for a life of being a merchant at his home in Charleston, South Carolina. He also had the opportunity to spend more than a year in traveling. It was while in Europe that he began to write revolutionary pamphlets, gaining him renown as a patriot. He served as vice president of South Carolina in 1776 and was then elected to the Continental Congress. He succeeded John Hancock as president in 1777 and served for 1 year until he was appointed as ambassador to the Netherlands. Unfortunately for the cause of for the young nation, he was captured by an English warship while he was crossing the Atlantic to go to the Netherlands, and spent the rest of the war in the Tower of London, which was fun. After the Battle of Yorktown, which, if you remember from last week, that's the last battle in the war and the British surrender at Yorktown, the American government got his freedom. They exchanged Lawrence for Cornwallis, who was the general of the British armies, Lord Cornwallis. So they exchanged him for Henry Lawrence and got him back that way. So that's pretty dramatic. I can really go into all that in the notes. John Jay, 1745 to 1829. He was the first Secretary of State, first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, one of its first ambassadors, and one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, which were written by 3 people. He was one of them, along with, oh my goodness, I'm totally blanking. Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton. Wow, I don't know why it took me that long. He was a founding father, but accidentally missed signing the Declaration of Independence because he had temporarily left to go help New York. So he actually missed out on signing the Declaration in a weird thing of fate. Nevertheless, he was chosen by his peers to succeed Henry Lawrence as President of the United States, serving a full term for 1 year. A conservative New York lawyer was what he was. Notice again how many people are lawyers or become judges later. He was very conservative. He was originally an aristocrat, which means he was very rich, and he turned into a patriot and spent 25 years of his life helping establish the American nation. During those years, he won the regard of his peers as a dedicated and accomplished statesman, a man of unwavering principle. He prepared to address the people of Canada and Great Britain while in Continental Congress. In New York, he drafted the state constitution, served as Chief Justice during the war. He was president of the Continental Congress when he undertook a difficult assignment as ambassador to gain support and funds from Spain. Ultimately, we got them actually from France. He helped Franklin, Jefferson, Adams, and Lawrence complete the peace negotiations in Paris in 1783, and then became the first Secretary of State. He negotiated valuable commercial treaties with Russia and Morocco, and helped keep our boundaries from Spain and Britain, both to the north and the south. It's ours, not yours. And he... let's see, what else? I lost my spot. He wrote 5 of the Federalist Papers, which were a set of papers that were written to defend the Articles of Confederation, written to defend the Constitution. He wrote 5 and then got sick. Hamilton wrote 51 because he could. And they were each supposed to divide the work evenly, not having that many. And then Hamilton, because he just never stopped doing anything, just wrote 51 because he could. Why not? And then he actually had a treaty that was named after him called the Jay Treaty. That's cool. And he engaged in a lifelong struggle to abolish slavery and was one of the founders of the American Bible Society. So there you go. Samuel Huntington, 1732 to 1796. He was an industrious youth who mastered his studies of the law without an advantage of school, a tutor, a master, and was just borrowing books and snatching opportunities to read and research in between jobs that he got. And he was one of the greatest self-made men among the founders. He was also one of the greatest legal minds of the age. All the more remarkable for his lack of advantage as a youth, considering he had no formal schooling. In 1764, he was elected to the General Assembly of Connecticut. The next year, he was chosen to serve on the Executive Council. In 1774, he was appointed as an associate judge of the Supreme Court and a delegate to the Continental Congress. And he served in the Congress for 5 consecutive terms, during the last of which he was actually elected president. He served in that office from 1779 until he got sick, and he had to resign in 1781. He then returned home to Connecticut and again took his seat in the Congress once he had recovered in 1783, but then left it to become the Chief Justice of the Superior Court of Connecticut. According to John Jay, his predecessor, he said that about Samuel Huntington, he was the most precisely trained Christian jurist, court person, to ever serve his country, which is quite high praise. Thomas McKean, 1734 to 1817. During his astonishingly varied 50-year career in public life. 50 years. He held almost every possible position you could, from deputy county attorney to president of the United States under the Confederation. Besides signing the Declaration of Independence, he contributed significantly to the development and establishment of the government in both the state of Delaware and the nation. At the Stamp Act Congress, he proposed the voting procedure that Congress ultimately adopted, namely that each colony, regardless of its size or population, had one vote. It was a practice adopted by the Continental Congress and the Congress of the Confederation, and the principal state equality manifested in the composition of the Senate, which we have currently. As a county judge in 1765, he defied the British by ordering his court to only work with documents that did not bear the stamps, if you remember the Stamp Act. He refused to use any paper that had the British stamp on it. Which is fantastic. In 1776, McKean joined with Caesar Rodney, who was one of the oldest members, to register Delaware's approval of the Declaration of Independence. They had 3 people voting in Delaware. He and Caesar Rodney both voted yes and shot down the other person of Delaware, saying, nope, we're going to go for independence, which is awesome. And therefore, it was a unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of Independence. He helped draft the Constitution for Delaware, and he signed the Articles of Confederation. He was president from 1781 to 1782, and then he received the news from Washington that the British had surrendered at the Battle of Yorktown. As Chief Justice on the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, he continued to establish the legal system in that state. And he strongly supported the Constitution of Pennsylvania, declaring it the best the world had ever seen. At 65, after 40 years of public service, he resigned from his post of Chief Justice and was a candidate for the Democratic-Republican ticket of 1799 to become president. He was elected ticket to be elected governor. He was elected governor, and as governor followed a strict policy of appointing only fellow Republicans, very conservative people, that he became the father of it in America. He served 3 terms as governor and completed one of the longest continuous careers of public service of any of the founding fathers. John Hanson, 1715 to 1783. So he died right as the war was ending. He was the heir of one of the greatest family traditions of colonies, a patriarch of a long family of patriots. Wow, there's a lot of stuff here. One of his relatives was a signer of the Declaration. Another was a signer of the Constitution. So there's a lot of Hansons on those documents, you'll notice. But not John. His 2 sons were killed in action with the Continental Army. A grandson served as a member of Congress under the new Constitution. Another grandson was elected as the Maryland senator. Thus, even if Hanson had not served as president himself, he would have greatly contributed to the life of the nation through his ancestry and his children. As a youngster, he began a self-guided reading of the classics, similar to someone else, and rather quickly became acknowledged as an expert in the jurisdictionalism of Anselm and the practical philosophy of Seneca, which was a Roman philosopher. So, let me see. In 1777, he was elected to Congress. He was elected president of it in 1781, served in that office from 1781 to 82. He was the first president to serve a full term after the ratification of the Articles of Confederation. And like so many of the Southern and New England founders, he strongly opposed the Constitution when it was first discussed. And then he ultimately died shortly after that. Elias Boudinot, my favorite name, 1741 to 1802. He did not sign the Declaration, the Articles, or the Constitution. He did not serve in the Continental Army with distinction. He was not renowned for his legal mind or his political skills. He was instead a man who spent his entire career in foreign diplomacy. He earned the respect of his fellow patriots after the days following the traitor Benedict Arnold. Fun story that you get in 6th grade, just going to say. He handled relations with Canada that kept them from being at war with him. and was elected to the Congress of New Jersey. He served as Secretary of Foreign Affairs and managed the aid from France, Spain, and Holland. In 1782, he was elected to the presidency. He served in that until 83, and like so many of the early presidents, he was a classically trained scholar of the Reformed faith. He was the father and grandfather of frontiersmen, and one of his grandchildren and namesakes eventually became the leader of the Cherokee Nation in its bid for independence. There we go. Thomas Mifflin, 1744 to 1800. By an ironic sort of providence, Thomas Mifflin served as George Washington's first aide-de-camp in the beginning of the Revolutionary War, basically secretary and assistant to George Washington. As President of the United States, it was he who accepted Washington's resignation from his post as commander, which, had to be probably emotional. In the years between, Mifflin served greatly the cause of freedom, and served as the first quartermaster general of the Continental Army. He obtained desperately needed supplies for the new army, and also at the same time made a bit of a profit for himself. He preferred being on the front lines and distinguished himself in military actions in Long Island. He was born and raised a Quaker, similar to Ben Franklin, and he was excluded from their meetings for his military activities because they were peaceful, so they couldn't really allow any violence of that sort. He lost favor with Washington after a while, which was not great. He was probably the most controversial of any of the 14 lost presidents, so that's fun. He was elected as president of the Continental Congress from 83 to 84. And he took a firm stand for independence and was fighting for it and helped obtain both men and supplies for Washington's army early in the critical period of the war. He signed the treaty with Great Britain in 84, which ended the war. And although a delegate, he did not make any significant contribution besides signing the document. So that's mostly him. Richard Henry Lee, 1732 to 1794. His resolution that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states was approved by the Continental Congress July 2nd of 1776. It was the first official act of the United Colonies that set them irrevocably on the road to independence. It was not surprising that it came from Lee's pen, for as early as 1768 he proposed the idea of committees corresponding among the colonies. In 74, he recommended that the colonies meet in what ultimately became the Continental Congress. From the first, his eye was on independence. A wealthy Virginia planter whose ancestors had been granted extensive lands by King Charles II, Lee disdained the traditional aristocratic role and view. In the House of Burgesses, he flatly denounced the practice of slavery, and he saw independent America as an asylum where the unhappy man may find solace, and the persecuted may find repose. In 1764, when news of the proposed Stamp Act reached Virginia, Lee was a member of the committing House of Burgesses that drew up an address to the king, an official protest against the tax. So awesome. After the tax was established, he organized citizens of his county into a group that pledged to buy no British goods until the Stamp Act was repealed. So, one of the first strikes on something. At the First Continental Congress, he persuaded representatives from all the colonies to adapt his non-importation idea, which means they wouldn't receive any imports from England, so any goods that were sent from England to America, they wouldn't accept them. He also proposed that a militia be organized and armed, and this was the year before shots were fired at Lexington, which was the shot heard around the world. But this and other proposals of his were considered too radical at the time. Sorry, hold on. Coffee. Oh, that's good stuff. Okay. 3 days after Lee introduced his resolution in 1776, Congress appointed him to the committee responsible for drafting the Declaration of Independence, but he was called home when his wife fell dangerously ill. His young protege and student, Thomas Jefferson, was thus set to do this task. Thus, Lee missed out on the chance to draft the document of the Declaration of Independence, though his influence greatly shaped it, and he was able to return in time to sign it. He was elected president, serving from 84 to 85, and he was succeeded by the second administration of John Hancock, because remember, Hancock served 2 times, very far apart. So John Hancock succeeded him, and he, let's see, what else? Where did it go? When the Constitution was completed and sent to the states for ratification, Lee opposed it strongly, saying it was anti-Christian and undemocratic. However, as one of Virginia's first senators, he helped assure the passage of amendments that he felt corrected many of the document's gravest faults. The first 10 of those were called the Bill of Rights. He was the great uncle of Robert E. Lee, one of the most famous generals from the War Between the States, and led to a great family tradition. All right, almost done. I'm sorry. I know it's a little long, but it is going into detail on all these men. Last three. Nathaniel Gorham, 1738 to 1796. Another self-made man, Gorham was one of the many resourceful Boston merchants who risked all that he had for the cause of freedom. He was first elected to the Massachusetts General Court in 71. His honesty and integrity won his acclaim, and thus was among the first delegates to choose to serve in the Continental Congress. Was chosen to serve. He remained in public service throughout the war and during the constitutional period, though his greatest contribution was his call for a stronger central government. He did not believe that that a union could peacefully be maintained for more than 100 years, which he was correct. We had the War Between the States less than 100 years after this. He was convinced that eventually, in order to avoid a civil war, smaller regional interests should pursue an independent course and be free of the government. He was correct because we got into a war with ourselves. His support of the new Constitution was rooted in pragmatism, which is just what's easy, essentially, than ideology. When John Hancock was unable to complete his second term, Gorham was elected to succeed him from 1786 to 87. It was during this time that Congress actually entertained the idea of asking Prince Henry, the brother of Friedrich II of Prussia, and Bonnie Prince Charlie, to consider the possibility of creating a constitutional monarch in America. If you didn't know that at one point we wanted a monarch instead of England, we did. So they thought about this idea of inviting someone in to be the king, but he had to follow a constitution and pass things along. So basically like a president, but for life. It was a plan that had much to recommend it, but eventually advocates of republicanism held the day. During the final years of his life, Gorham was concerned with several speculative land deals, which cost him basically his entire fortune. All right, second to last, Arthur St. Clair. He was born and educated in Edinburgh, Scotland during the tumultuous days of the Jacobite Rising and the Tartan Suppression. It's fun stories if you want to look those up. St. Clair was the only president of the United States born and raised on foreign soil, though most of his family and friends abandoned their devastated homeland in the years following the Battle of Culloden, after which nearly a third of the land was depopulated through immigration to America because England was trying to crush the Scottish. He stayed behind to learn the ways of the English in the Royal Navy, and his plan was to learn the enemy's militia in order to fight with them on a different day, which he did. During the French and Indian War, he was stationed in America. Afterwards, he settled in Pennsylvania, where many of his kin had established themselves. His civic-mindedness quickly became apparent, and he helped to organize both the New Jersey and Pennsylvania militias and led the Continental Army's Canadian expedition and was then elected to Congress. His long years of training in the enemy camp were finally paying off, and he was elected to president in 1787 and served from February 2nd of that year until January 21st of 1788. Following his term of duty in the highest office in the land, he became the first governor of the Northwest Territory, and he founded the city of Cincinnati. Fun factoid there. He briefly supported the idea of creating a constitutional monarchy under Bonnie Prince Charlie, and he was a strident anti-federalist, believing that the proposed federal constitution would eventually allow for the intrusion of government into virtually every sphere and aspect of life. Wow, that hurts considering that's true. Ouch. He even predicted that under vastly expanded centralized powers of the state, the taxing powers of bureaucrats and other unelected officials would eventually confiscate as much as a quarter of the income of the citizens, a notion that seemed laughable at the time, but has proven to be ominously modest in light of our current governmental leviathan. Yep. It's called taxes. St. Clair lived to see the hated English tyrants who destroyed his homeland defeated, but he despaired that his adopted home might actually create a similar tyranny and impose it accidentally upon themselves. And finally, Cyrus Griffin. His is nice and short. 1736 to 1796. Like Peyton Randolph, he was trained in London's Inner Temple to be a lawyer and thus was counted among his nation's legal elite. Like so many other Virginians, he was anti-federalist, though he eventually accepted the new Constitution with the promise of the Bill of Rights. Anti-federalist just means they didn't like the Constitution because they saw a lot of flaws in it, which it had them. And the Bill of Rights was 10 amendments to the Constitution to try and fix it. So he supported the changes to it. The Articles of Confederation afforded such freedoms that he had been convinced, even with the incumbent loss of liberty, some new form of government would be required. He was a protege of George Washington, had worked with him on several land deals in the West. He was a reluctant supporter of the constitutional ratifying process. During his term of office as presidency, the last before the National Compact went into effect, the ratification was formalized and finalized. He served as the nation's chief executive president from 1788 till April 30th of 1789, when George Washington was inaugurated as President of the United States under the Constitution. Okay, so that's your summary of those. I apologize it was a bit long, but it's also, it's a lot of information to go over. So if you made it all the way through, good job. If you didn't, that's okay. Anyways, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I miss you all very much.